we retread familiar ground, occasionally dislodging a boulder to crush a Figar, on this episode of NES Works Gaiden.
The only thing we serve is tongue. Nothing.
Well, if it isn't Chack'n Pop. Yeah, it seems like I couldn't get away from this one for very long. Since this one recently showed up on Gaiden, there's no real need for me to get into the details again. This is the same game as the SG-1000 version. Or is it? I mean, obviously the graphics have more color and detail than the SG-1000 version, that's a given. And it moves faster and more smoothly, because the Famicom could handle sprite movement more fluidly than the SG-1000 did. So, Chack'n Pop on Famicom is just a faster, prettier version of the SG-1000 game, right? Well, actually, no. The fundamentals remain identical here. You control Chack'n, a sort of bird thing that has to retrieve a bunch of hearts that horrible monsters have absconded with, throwing his relationship with Mrs. Chack'n into disarray. Your mission is to travel through a series of platform mazes in order to liberate the stolen hearts from cages, at which point they'll float away and break through the barrier at the current stage's exit. Chack'n can cling to ceilings, and he can drop bombs to his left and his right in order to break apart cages, destroy monsters, and break through brittle walls. However, beyond the first stage, Chack'n Pop on Famicom amounts to a different game. Its level layouts look and work quite differently than the ones on the SG-1000. Sega recreated the arcade game's level designs quite fastidiously, whereas the Famicom version's developer just kinda made up their own from what I can tell. It's a bold move by that developer, Tosei, whose track record here on Famicom leaves something to be desired at this point. And I have to say, I don't think these new level designs work nearly as well as the ones on SG-1000. Chack'n Pop is meant to be challenging because it's an early 80s arcade title and that's what they did, but these new layouts feel a lot more punishing than the arcade and Sega levels. It's harder to lure monsters into range of your explosives, and that's not just because everything moves faster here. Rather, platforms tend to be smaller and arranged in ways that require great precision in bomb placement so they don't roll off and explode in the wrong place. Even cages require perfect play to break apart. By stage 2, you begin to encounter cages placed in such a way that you can only open them by reaching upward and dropping a bomb at the exact apex of your stretch, which requires a far more intimate relationship with the game mechanics than I really think is reasonable for that early in the game. I guess you could think of Famicom Jack and Pop as the equivalent of Championship Lode Runner, a remixed version of the game tuned for expert play. Which is a shame. This is the version of Chack'n Pop that's been most widely disseminated and played by far, thanks to emulation and multicarts, but it doesn't really represent the game as originally designed. I suppose in an ideal world there would be a version of Chack'n Pop that combines the Famicom tech with the SG-1000 layouts, but so far that doesn't exist. The only ROM hack I can find online just replaces the sprites with Toho characters. Well, I suppose there's always the arcade port coming on the Taito Egret 2 Mini, assuming that thing actually comes to the US. And another game we've already seen, right here on NES Works Gaiden, Dig Dug. Previously, we looked at GCC's excellent conversion for Atari 7800, and while that was a great take on the game, it just can't begin to compare to Namco's own spectacular work converting the game to Famicom. By the time Dig Dug hit Famicom, the coin-op classic had already made its way to a bunch of consoles in the West, as well as to Japanese computers. Heck, if the 7800 had launched as intended in 1984, that excellent version would have already been on the market as well. But with this iteration, Namco knocked it out of the park. As with Galaga, the conversion from console to home platforms necessitated a few minor tweaks, so you can't call this adaptation arcade perfect, but it certainly comes close. It looks, moves, plays, and sounds incredibly close to the real thing. Other versions, like Namco's port to MSX, did a damn good job of recapturing the arcade game's spirit. But the Famicom's technical advantages over other platforms come into play here. This version features things like properly colored sprites and smooth movement, subtle factors that nevertheless add up to a better game experience. But all that really changes is the height of the playfield, which ends up being slightly compressed due to the shift from a vertical to a horizontal screen arrangement. You'll find everything that appeared in the coin-op here. A little guy digging through the earth while being chased by inflatable monsters. By inflatable monsters, I don't mean that the creatures are like pool toys. I mean that your hero's sole form of defense consists of a harpoon and an air pump that you can launch at enemies and use to fill them with air until they explode. It's kind of horrible and graphic when you stop and think about it, but it never comes across as gruesome thanks to the endlessly charming pixel artwork of Hiroshi Ono. Dig Dug himself, also known as Mr. Driller's dad, Taizo Hori, looks almost exactly like a spaceman in his white uniform, but rather than plying the furthest reaches of the galaxy, he's instead forging deep beneath the Earth. His task is to exterminate all the deadly monsters emerging from the Earth, which take two forms, little round guys called pukas, and larger dragon-like beasts called Figars. The former tend to move more aggressively and flock together in large numbers, while the latter get about more deliberately, but have the ability to roast Taizo with their flaming breath, which can even penetrate thin walls to get at him. Taizo needs to balance offense and evasion. Since your goal is to wipe out all the monsters, you need to go after them. But it's important not to do so carelessly, lest you allow yourself to become surrounded and end up dead. In my opinion, Dig Dug was the only time Namco managed to create a truly great Pac-Man sequel, bearing in mind, of course, that Ms. Pac-Man was a GCC joint. Sure, Dig Dug isn't technically a Pac-Man game or sequel, but it alone, within the classic Namco pantheon, manages to take the maze chase design of the company's biggest hit and put a worthwhile new twist on it. The behaviors and effects of Pac-Man mechanics are echoed here, but they all share interesting new relationships. For example, there are no dots, as clearing out the monsters themselves is the metric by which you advance from level to level. However, the key effect of dots, slowing down your forward progress to leave you more vulnerable to pursuers, has been transferred to the dirt you clear away to create paths. Moving through empty space allows you to stay ahead of monsters, but when you dig through soil, the resistance of that barrier reduces your speed enough to make you more likely to be caught. Of course, the upside is that you don't have to work within the constraints of an existing maze. You define the maze yourself with the choices you make as you dig. And of course, Taizo doesn't spend the entire game defenseless, save for energizers he collects. While enemies can kill him on contact at any moment, he can turn the tables with his air pump. Because enemies greatly outnumber Taizo and can move freely through solid barriers in unpredictable ways, he never feels grossly overpowered, despite being permanently armed with a tool for self-defense. Even the pump itself has to be deployed tactically. Enemies only detonate after several blasts of air, and in the time it takes to fully inflate a foe, Taizo has to stand motionless with his harpoon lodged in the monster being destroyed. This leaves him a sitting target for the several seconds in which he focuses on his opponent, as other monsters can charge right on past a stunned and semi-inflated foe to attack him. Taizo can break contact and fire his harpoon into the new attacking foe, but that allows the partially inflated monster to return to normal and resume its own attack. Crowd management and keeping a watchful eye on all the threats on the screen are your key survival tactics here, as you need to go after enemies without putting yourself at too much risk. For those who care about things like high scores, Dig Dug offers a few opportunities for bonus points. Fruits and vegetables appear from time to time in the center of the screen, just like in Pac-Man, though the morsels you collect here tend to be tubers and other plants that grow underground, instead of sweet dessert fruits. A skilled player can also make use of the rocks placed throughout the screen to crush enemies. By removing the earth beneath a rock, you can cause that stone to plummet downward until it hits soil again, crushing everything in its path. That includes you, so you definitely need to take a tactical approach to the rock dropping process. But if you can squash multiple monsters with a single rock, you'll net huge rewards, more than justifying the effort. It's a tidy game, one whose simple setup unfolds into consistent yet unpredictable outcomes on each playthrough. And Namco absolutely nailed the Famicom conversion, maintaining their pattern of excellence here. It's a shame that this version of Dig Dug never reached the NES, because it's easily the best home port ever released prior to the arrival of Namco's proper arcade anthologies in the PlayStation era. But Americans didn't totally miss out. As with Galaga's NES conversion, this version of Dig Dug has been known to appear on Bandai Namco's modern-era plug-and-play or standalone devices in place of the arcade ROM, a testament to the enduring legacy of the NES on a chip platform.
Wow, we're 3 for 3 this week on retreads. This time we have Flappy, a game we've already seen on Game Boy. Back in the early days of this channel, when I called everything Game Boy World and only talked about Game Boy games. But this one's the Famicom game that precedes the Game Boy release by several years.
As you may recall, Flappy came into the world courtesy of a long-forgotten computer development studio called DB Soft, who make their Famicom debut here. Some of DB Soft's computer work had been every bit as sketchy as you'd expect from a company that was active in the wild west of content that was Japanese personal computers in the early 1980s. But there's nothing prurient about Flappy. This game couldn't be purer. The tale of a bird or something named Flappy that wants to move glowing rocks onto glowing platforms. One of the classic narratives, really. It's not that different than Chack'n Pop. Flappy has to move his burden about while contending with both wandering monsters and Newtonian forces. At its most fundamental level, you could describe Flappy the game as Sokoban plus gravity, plus a little bird guy. Ubiquitous as the game was, we haven't actually seen a Sokoban adaptation for Famicom to this point in the system's history, so Flappy stands out as something of a novelty here. It's a more interesting and engaging game than Sokoban in any case, so you can say that Famicom got off on the right foot compared to like every other Japanese console of the 80s. Again, you need to push a flashing boulder onto a flashing space, but the process of doing that requires a lot of careful planning. Despite seeming to play out from a top-down viewpoint, Flappy incorporates a gravity mechanic. When you push a boulder so that nothing appears immediately beneath it, that boulder plummets until it hits ground. Kinda like the ones in Dig Dug, all the way down to the fact that a falling boulder will instantly kill any living creature it lands on, whether that's a wandering monster or Flappy. One critical factor of note here, there's only one flashing boulder per level, but each stage contains multiple rocks you can push. Only the flashing rock is required to summon the goal panel in order to complete a stage, but the other stones have their own role to play. Some of them you'll need to push around so they clear away a monster, while others need to move around to provide platforms for the flashing boulder to be pushed across. Some even need to give the main boulder a ride of sorts, where you push the standard rock a half space, then shift the flashing boulder across the top of it, then nudge the brown rock another half space, and so forth. It's a pretty decent puzzler, though the Famicom version moves at a much faster clip than the Game Boy port, which causes a small problem in practice. See, Flappy has the ability to shatter standard boulders by pushing them against a wall, another boulder, or an enemy. The relatively zippy controls of this version cause rocks to disintegrate into powder if your finger slips even slightly, or if you happen to push the rock for just a split second too long while moving it into place against a wall. This is the largest shortcoming of an otherwise solid puzzle port. Those brittle rocks can ruin an otherwise perfect level run, and it's really pretty frustrating to work your way through a multi-part puzzle process only for the touchy controls to cause you to crush a boulder you need for the final step of the stage. Flappy does have a password system that appears every 5 levels at least, so even if you can't continue from where the game ends, you don't have to start over from zero. It's not quite perfect, but this is one of the better Famicom puzzlers to date.
Next time on NES Works Gaiden, more games you've already seen, but at least this time one of them comes with a weird controller.